Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Cielle Heiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology.
I'm Lori Kaufman, an astrologer, tarot reader, writer, and teacher. I co-lead the Asteroid Special Interest Research Group for NCGR, an astrology organization, and I offer all different sorts of readings, online and in person.
I'm Alicia Cielle Heiser, an astrologer, herbalist, and witch living in Oregon on Kalapuya land, and I offer astrology consultations and teachings aimed at helping you honor your most authentic self and trust your intuition. Hi everyone. Today we'll be talking about what houses mean in astrology and how you can work with this really simple and very profound theory to make sense out of how astrological movements in the sky are impacting you in your daily life. And so people are always talking about different houses in astrology and how you should pay attention to the houses of your birth chart for different things. And it's really easy to get confused and not really be clear on what exactly that means. And so, to make it really simple, what the houses in astrology are is they are how the sky and the planetary movements meets us on Earth. And so, I will share a screen to help kind of visually depict this. But this is a graph of the different house topics in astrology. And this is, made to look like a birth chart if you ever work with a circular drawn birth chart like astrologers do, as opposed to the charts that they use in CoStar. What that chart is actually depicting is the sky. And so from this point in this chart, the very center is us on Earth. And the line where the first house and the seventh house are is literally the horizon. And so when you're looking at a birth chart, everything that's above this point would have been visible in the sky, and everything below this point would have been below the horizon and not visible at the time that that chart was cast. And so when you're working with a chart in this way and dividing it into the 12 houses, it is centered on our terrestrial perspective on Earth, and it is making sense out of how celestial movements are impacting us in very tangible ways with different life topics. As you can see, if Mars is moving through your 10th house, or if you have Mars in your 10th house natally, that's going to be very activating for your public life, your reputation, your work. It might be descriptive of your boss. As opposed to if you have Mars down in the 4th house, it's going to be a lot more related to your home and family and ancestors. So that's just a very quick summary of like why we work with houses as astrologers. Do you have anything you want to add to that, Lori?
Yeah. So typically when people start to learn or understand astrology, you know your planets, you might know your sun sign. But that's basically just the sign that those planets are in or were transiting through at the time of your birth. So then the houses do a good job of showing you where exactly in the sky that they were. So if your sun is in the first house, you were born at sunrise. So if your sun and your ascendant are the same sign, is another way to say that, you would have been born at sunrise. If your sun is in the opposite sign of your ascendant or in your seventh house, that's your descendant. So that's the sign that's lowering into the horizon. And so how I like to look at it is basically the first house, I mean, that's you, right? That's your body. That's you entering the earth. It's the sign that's rising up over the horizon at that time of your birth. And so from there, the sun will slowly tick across the sky throughout the day. And people ask a lot, like, do I need to know the exact time for my chart or things like that? And the reason you do is because if you think about it, the sun does move pretty quickly throughout the day from sunrise to sunset. And so what a chart does is it pulls exactly that snapshot of where all of the planets looked like they were. And So it depends on the house system that you read. Both of us read whole sign. Um, but there are definitely other ways to divide the sky and other ways of calculation. But with whole sign, it basically takes each whole sign, each individual sign, and places it in a house. And so horoscopes are written in this way as well. When we see the planets moving through the sky right now, like going back to the Mars example, Mars is currently in Cancer, and I am a Cancer rising. So Mars is moving through my first house at this moment. And so I would, if I was reading a horoscope, if I was reading it for my sun sign, which is Aquarius, that wouldn't make a whole lot of sense. My sun is in the eighth house. And so I would want to read it for Cancer because that's going to talk about what a Mars transit would look like in my first house. And so that's kind of where that division comes through. And then the meanings have all been assigned to the houses from there. I also like to look at everything in opposition. I think that's the easiest way that I remember things like this. So if the first house is me, like I am entering the earth, right? This is my body, myself, my appearance, my style, my, you know, your own energy. What happens to you? If that is what's rising over the horizon, then what's descending is the opposite of you, right? Like it's me versus my partner and people that you have like a direct relationship with. So this is your marriage line, but it can also just be really prominent relationships. The seventh house rules contracts. So any person you have a contractual relationship with, so clients or a business partner, um, even I think a best friend tends to fall more seventh housey than 11th house, um, and things like that. And so from there, there are different ways to kind of break down the houses and their meanings.
Yeah, absolutely. And just really honing in on how the houses are where you make sense out of what's going on in the sky, right? So if we're,
Yes.
we're recording this in February of 2025, this will be coming out around June of 2025, and there's a lot of activation in Cancer. Right now, Mars is retrograding through Cancer, and by the time we get to June, Jupiter will move into Cancer, which is a very exciting, expansive transit that we'll all be experiencing. But when you hear that and you wonder, well, what does that mean for me? That's when the houses come in and become helpful. Because if you're like Lori and you're a Cancer rising, then the Mars retrograde is a period of deconstruction, frustration, irritation, reconsidering all of these different things related to yourself and your sense of identity. Whereas for me, as a Libra rising, for example, this Mars retrograde is this period of deconstructing and rebuilding in relationship to my 10th house and my public life and my work. And this Mars retrograde is not actually impacting my sense of self as much as it would a Cancer rising. And so understanding what houses are in your chart really helps you understand what life topics are being impacted by different transits and really makes astrology very tangible and very literal when you work with it that way. Another
Yeah.
very important component of this technique that we will be doing a whole separate episode on is that you're really looking at what planet rules the house as well and what's going on with that to get more information about the house. And so, if you're talking about Cancer, if we stick with Cancer, then my Cancer 10th house is going to be very flavored by my moon in Pisces ruling that Cancer 10th house. Whereas Lori's Cancer first house is going to be very flavored by her moon in Aries ruling her first house. And so, if this is a new concept for you, go check out our episode about planetary rulership for the houses. But that gives you more information because, sticking with the Mars retrograde example, that Mars retrograde will be impacting Cancer and your Cancer house because Mars is moving through Cancer, but it will also be impacting your Aries and Scorpio houses because Mars rules Aries and Scorpio. So for me, for example, I find that during Mars retrogrades, because I'm a Libra rising and Mars rules my Scorpio second house of money and my Aries seventh house of relationships, that a lot of times there will be tension or conflict or things of the nature of Mars that come up in relationship to my money and my partnerships specifically. Whereas Lori might experience that more with her Aries 10th house and her work, and then her Scorpio 5th house and how she's dating people. So there's just different topics that come through, and looking at the house that the planet is in or moving through, and especially the house that the planet rules or houses, is really where you're going to get the most information. And that also means that in our birth charts, we have different threads that connect different life topics that are unique to
Mhm.
each rising sign. So, like I said,
Yeah.
as a Libra rising, any Libra rising will have a thread connecting their money to their partners because Mars rules both those topics in their life. And so you can really start to pull really nuanced stories out of your chart and out of transits when you work with this technique. And it can be really amazing the congruences you find when you start paying attention.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that's where a lot of the nuance of astrology actually comes in, because, um, you know, let's talk about sun signs for a bit because that's what everybody knows typically when you're first starting out. I'm an Aquarius sun, but I might meet another Aquarius sun who's extremely different, and then I might meet another Aquarius sun who's extremely different than both of us. And my sun being in the eighth house is going to be extremely different from somebody who has their sun in the third house or somebody who has their sun in the 10th house, right? Because my sun in the eighth manifests in a lot of different ways that have a lot to do with those eighth house topics that are written right there, the shared resources, psyche, death, taxes, like
Hmm.
all of those really big themes do tend to come up for me a lot, and like occult things and um, spooky stuff, whatever, however you want to look at the eighth house. But the 10th house is more like a public figure, right? And so traditionally people with sun in the 10th house were a leader of some sort. And so, that's going to be somebody who's very, very public, whereas, mine is still above the horizon line. I still have a day chart. I still am very solar. The eighth house is just very different from the 10th. And then having the sun below the horizon, and we did a whole episode on sect, which basically just means do you have a day chart or night chart. Um, but those little aspects are going to give a lot as well.
Yeah. And so, this is just the tip of the iceberg. We're doing a whole series talking about house topics in astrology, and hopefully you can get a taste of how much nuance can come through and how much you can do when you're working
Hmm.
with house topics astrologically. But really just coming back to that's how you make sense out of what's going on in the sky and what that means for you tangibly and literally in your lived experience here on Earth. And philosophically, because that's one reason I'm so drawn to astrology and particularly Hellenistic astrology is when you ask, but why, but why, but why, you can always find philosophical reasons that come, like, that ground the theory.
Hmm.
And for house topics, where this comes from is it comes from Egyptian solar philosophy. And so that's where Lori was explaining like the when you pull a timed birth chart, what you're pulling is you need the time and place you were born, and then you cast a chart of exactly where all of the planets were in relationship to that land and that horizon where you were born at the time you were born, at the time you took your first breath. And so your rising sign, if you're a like 14-degree Scorpio rising sign, if you were born 30 minutes later, you might have been like a 25-degree Scorpio rising sign. And if you were born 3 hours later, you might be a Sagittarius or Capricorn rising. So
Right.
the chart changes very quickly because it's based off of diurnal rotation of the sun rising in the first house on the ascendant, moving through the sky, coming up to the top of the sky, going down and setting, and moving down through its underworld journey. And so when you're connecting a lot of the different theories of what the house topics signify, it comes back to the daily rotation of the sun. The eighth
Yeah.
house is a great example of this because, as Lori and I have talked about previously on the pod with her eighth house sun, when the sun is in the eighth house or the 12th house, it's in that place in the sky where it's like so blindingly hitting you. And so the eighth house
Casting
is,
shadows.
yes, it's the house where the sun goes to die. It's the house before it sets in the seventh house. And so that's why death is a topic in the eighth house. And as Lori said, it's the time of day when you start to cast shadows. And so that's why your psyche and fears and paranoias can come up. Whereas, the fourth house is associated with home and foundations because that's the very nadir of the chart generally, where the planets start to then pivot and move back up towards the horizon. And there's so
Yeah.
much we could say about Egyptian solar philosophy that is just like not. Maybe we'll do a separate episode on that. If you're interested, if you want more on
Yeah,
that,
yeah.
please let us know. But just to say that that is where the theory comes from, because when
Mhm.
Hellenistic astrology was developed in ancient Greece, or in ancient Egypt, actually, Hellenistic astrology was developed in Alexandria. They were taking Greek philosophy and Greek math, and they were merging it with a lot of Egyptian theories, including like the house theories, and also merging it with a lot of Mesopotamian work that the Mesopotamians had been doing for thousands of years, tracking and documenting the planets and the movements of the planets. But the house is specifically, that's why it's connected to the Earth, is because it's us viewing the planets moving through the sky every day from the perspective of us on Earth. Hey everyone, it's Alicia, and I offer 60 and 90-minute virtual astrology consultations where we explore your birth chart using Hellenistic techniques, myth, and herbal wisdom to help you understand the cycles weaving through your life so you can honor your most authentic self and trust your intuition. I'm offering 20% off my readings for listeners of the podcast when you use the code CONVO20 at checkout. The link to my booking page is in the show notes below.
And the last, well, another thing, maybe not the last, that I wanted to bring up too is another way to group the houses together are you can look at them as angular, succedent, and cadent houses. And so angular houses are the most important houses. And I always think that like any transit, any planet you have natally, like anything going on in those four angular houses are just going to be the most important things. It's that first and seventh house that we just talked about. Obviously, you are the most important thing in your chart. Your partner or partnerships, marriage, clients, like those are going to come next, like the people in your life. And then we're going to have our fourth house and our 10th house. And that's going to be like a home slash work life balance, right? So like work life balance comes in through that 10th and fourth house. So obviously the 10th house is the public one. It's the one above the horizon. Um, Mathematically, it's typically about where your MC is, which is also a public image line. Sometimes it can fall in the ninth or 11th house. Um, but the 10th house is your reputation. It's who you are. It's your career. It's like a lot about like what you're known for. And I like to see it as kind of like a mark you leave on the world or like what you're seen as. That's not always your day job, but so some people it's not your career, it's not what you end up doing. But it can be like the thing that you end up known for, that kind of stuff. Whereas the fourth house is that like home, family, ancestry, roots, like who you are on the very deepest level, your foundation, and like where you come from. And then from there, you can kind of fill in what the other houses are. So, succeedent houses are the ones that are rising up into an angular house. So these are the secondary best, I guess, if you want to say. Um, they are your second house, your eighth house, your fifth house, and your 11th house. And so your second house is money, right? Things that you need, your resources. Um, Opposite to the eighth house of shared resources, shared money. And then fifth house is hobbies, children, sexuality, like fun, joyful things in life. And then that's opposite the 11th house, which is luck, community, friends. Um, was also seen as the house of like hopes, dreams, wishes for the future because it's rising into the 10th house. They also say that the first house is the best house. Like you're it's seen to have extra help or like you know, even if it's a bad, quote, bad placement, it kind of like accidentally has some extra dignity if it's in the first, the 10th, or the
Wi-
11th specifically. Yeah,
Yeah. And also with that, like the first 10th and 11th, just because those are some of the best life topics.
right.
But also, when just one thing to add to the angular
Hmm.
houses with the first, fourth, seventh, and 10th is I think of those as kind of if you've ever played Mario Kart and you get like a little speed boost when you're like racing, planets get that when they're in the angular houses. They're
Yeah.
at a literal pivot point. Like the first and seventh houses are the horizon, and the
Hmm.
10th and fourth house are generally around the 10th house is like the highest point that a planet will make in its daily trajectory through the sky. And so because they're on pivots, they're like I've also heard them and been taught that they're like the stakes of the chart as well. And they're just these pivot points of like extra juice, extra energy. If you have a
Hmm.
planet in an angular house, it'll probably be louder than planets in other houses might be. And there's just more of a focus on those topics because of that as well.
Yeah, yeah. I really like that. That's a fun way of thinking about it.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, the little boost. But yeah, yeah, the angular houses are super important. And then the 11th house was seen as like just also really great because it has a lot of help as well. Um, and so typically easier, better topics tend to like filter into these different types, the angular and mostly Cecedent, because they are about to move into an angular house. So they are seen as helpful or like, um, what's the word I'm looking for? They're
I think of it as they're building
supporting.
energy. Like they're
Yeah,
yes, so they're supporting,
supporting.
like your first house, you need to be supported by some sort of like when you're born, you're swaddled in a blanket. Like there's some
Mhm.
material thing in this world that supports your incarnation. But then
Right.
also when planets are in succedent houses, they're rising up and they're gaining momentum
Right.
as
Yeah.
opposed to
Yeah,
cadent
as opposed to Caden
houses.
houses. Caden houses are falling away
Mhm.
from the angular houses. So they are seen as the more difficult areas of life. These are the third house, the sixth house, the ninth house, and the 12th house. And I've noticed that like the Cadent houses tend to have just like more stuff almost like jam-packed into them. Like you can pretty much simplify that you can simplify the angular houses in like one or two words. And I feel like the Succinate houses you can like almost kind of do the same, but like the Cadent houses are just kind of a lot of things. They're
Mhm.
almost like everything else that didn't really have a space. Um, and they tend to be things that are a little bit more difficult. Um, and so the third house and the ninth house are seen as a little bit better, specifically the ninth house, than the sixth and the 12th, just because they make an aspect to the first house. Same with the fifth and the 11th for the Cecedent houses as well. The second and eighth house they're dark houses. They don't make an
Yeah.
aspect to the first. So,
And
to, sorry.
sorry, just to really dig into that because that's so
Mhm.
important actually, because the
Yeah.
theory is that the first house is like the crack where the light gets through, or it's like the life force of the chart. The first house is so important because it literally is you. All the other houses are like your boss, your partner, your dog, but the first house is you. That's why your ascendant matters. And so when the houses form an angle, like literally a geometric angle. We should also do episodes on aspects actually. But when
We
they form
should.
an angle to the ascendant, it's said that they get like the life force and the support of the ascendant. So like the
Yes.
ninth house, the third, the fifth Whereas like the 12th house or the 6th house or the 8th house or the second house, those houses, like Lori said, are dark houses where they cannot see the ascendant. Literally, the angle that the first house makes to the 8th and 6th house is the blind spot of a car. It's 150 degrees. And then from
Yeah.
the 12th and the second, it's just if you were sitting next to someone and you couldn't turn your head. So, but just like the life force, the like vitalizing light of the ascendant reaching the other houses was really the tidbit I wanted to share because I feel like
Yeah.
with that solar philosophy, that is a pretty strong part of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what I was about to say too, basically,
Okay.
is the second, eighth, sixth, and 12th are the dark houses that like I like to think of them as the blind spot in the car, but if you're not paying attention, if you're not triple checking that blind spot, you could hit them, right?
Hmm.
And so there is this aspect of like fears and anxieties and like difficulties, and the dark houses tend to have a lot to do with topics that are harder to talk about. So like, it's not always easy to talk about your money situation, or shared resources, like when you merge with a partner, that's not always easy. And death and taxes and inheritance, things that you're given, it's like other people's stuff, whether you wanted it or not, right? Um, and so those topics can also be very difficult to talk about or to work with or work through. A lot of people with heavy eighth or 12th house, sometimes sixth too, tend to work in like healthcare or therapy, or they deal with other people's stuff. They deal with other people's emotions, and the sixth house and 12th house specifically can help in hospitals and things like that. That can be like a way that these themes manifest in your life, because just because you have planets in a more difficult house doesn't mean like your life is always difficult, but you do have more difficult themes that you might deal with. And so like working in a hospital might be a way that you work through some of these themes, so you see it in other people. And that's just one example, but yeah, the sixth house rules things like pets and health and work. Um, it's kind of like your day-to-day schedule, like things that you very routinely have to do. Um, and we actually were talking about this in my class last night, like pets and small animals being sixth house because they're animals that you take care of on a day-to-day basis, and big animals like horses, cows, um, like really big animals tend to fall in the 12th house because they are often slaughtered for meat or for food, right? Um, and so like even just things like that, they are more difficult topics to talk about. Your sixth house can be health and your body and things that might chronically go wrong. The 12th house is also chronic things like mental health and self-undoing, um, unconscious stuff, and like solitude, like where you might need to be alone, or where you might find yourself alone, or loss, right? And so the cadent houses, I like to think of it too as like sustenance houses are like you just pulled up to a mountain and you're like hiking up the mountain. The angular houses are when you're at the top and like really enjoying the view and looking out and taking pictures and just like taking a minute up at the top. And then the sustenance houses, or sorry, the cadent houses are the houses of like the descent back down to your car, right? Back down the mountain to go find your car and drive home, right? And so sometimes like, you would think that the cadent part of it, the descent might be the easiest part, but often it is actually easier to go up a mountain, to hike up the mountain, than it is to find your footing to go down the mountain. And there's also like an exhaustion that kind of comes with it too. Like, at least on your way up, you're excited. You're like, wow, we made it. Like, we're gonna go see this view. Like, this is really cool. And like by the end of the cadent part, like by the end of the mountain that you're hiking, like you're just ready to get back to the car. Like, you're like, okay,
Yeah.
let's go home.
Yeah. And that's where like planets, if you have a planet in a cadent house, Or if you're experiencing a really heavy transit through one of your cadent houses,
Mhm.
there's just a lack of energy there. And so planets in cadent houses just have a little bit less juice. They might get worn out or burnt out more easily.
Yeah.
Um, you know how Lori pointed out that the cadent houses are kind of this like catch-all for all, because we're fitting every life topic into 12 houses here. So like there's a lot of overlap in that, and the cadent houses tend to catch a lot of that because they're really the houses of the general maintenance, like the
Mhm.
slog of day-to-day existence. I will say the majority of my chart are cadent placements. Like most of the herbalists I know have very strong sixth
Mhm.
house placements, myself included. And I think there's a lot of reimagining we can do around placements and like the deliciousness of just being in the day-to-day moments and how much is present there. But when you're talking about like success in the outer world, you don't tend to find that as much through the cadent houses as you would through the angular houses. And cadent planets can just like get a little sleepier, and you might yourself feel more tired more easily if you have a lot of cadent placements or if you're dealing with cadent transits. So just being gentle with yourself with that sort of cadent energy, because it is very different from that like capitalist grind culture, like that girl
Oh
boss
yeah.
culture that's out there. So,
Yeah, yeah. And I also want to point out too, like when we talk about the darker or more difficult houses, the second, eighth, sixth, and 12th, pretty often the third house ends up getting kind of lumped in with that as well as like the fifth. I hate saying worst, but like worst,
or
quote,
like
worst,
most difficult, like
most
these just deal
difficult.
with more difficult
Yeah,
life topics, they tend to, or they have less energy, which is the
right.
third house because it's below the horizon and it's cadent. So it's not like
Yeah,
good or bad, but it's describing experiences, and like certain things feel better and are easier, certain things are
right,
harder, and also that's different for all of us. Like some people may
right.
love existing in 12th house spaces, like that can be a very
Yeah, yeah,
monastic space. For example, if you're a
right.
nun or like a very spiritual person, you might love the 12th house, where someone else
Yeah,
might, really suffer in that space.
yeah, yeah. Um, for sure. And yeah, they were seen as fortunate or unfortunate houses back in the day, but I don't see them as like good or bad. They're just more they're just not easy topics to talk about typically.
Hmm.
And then the ninth house was seen as the least difficult of the Cadent houses because it made a trine to the first house, and that was seen as really positive and really helpful.
Hmm.
Um, so even though we do have this like cadency. The ninth house is still pretty exciting because it still rules travel and the ability to go out and to do big things. And something else I think about a lot with the houses too, kind of a little bit of a switch topic. Um, is the fact that like we live in a modern world, and when so much of this was originally assigned, things were very different back then. So of course, more modern things have been filtered into different houses, but I like to think about where they were coming from in the ancient days when they assigned these things. Especially like my favorite example is the difference between the fifth and the seventh house, because the fifth house is dating and children and sex and pleasure and all of the like that creative birthing space and um, your ability to find peace and happiness through your hobbies and like just all of those things. But the seventh house is marriage. And, it's interesting when you're first starting out to realize that like dating and marriage are two very, very different houses. Um, but back then, people were sold off, right? So you didn't marry for love back in those days, you were married off. Um, and so that would basically tell you a lot about how fortunate that marriage was, or if you got set up or whatever that is.
Yeah, like the planets that rule your seventh house that are in your seventh house, like
Mhm.
what's going on in your seventh house would be descriptive of the quality of your
Yes.
marriage. Yeah, to be just very clear. Like your chart
Right.
can just tell you so much. Like your seventh house is your partner, and like so it says, and the planet that rules your seventh house specifically will tell you a lot about that potential.
Yeah. Yeah. So, there are little minor differences because obviously we don't sell people off for marriage anymore, um, usually. But yeah, that it is
It's
really
definitely
like
less culturally
less,
common
right,
than
exactly.
like ancient Hellenistic
Hopefully
Greece,
it's not
where
still happening.
theory
Right.
was, yeah.
Exactly. So a lot of these theories, or like assignments of meaning, came from
Mhm.
places that, are very different than where we are now.
Yeah, and this is such a fascinating topic that we'll continue to dig into with our other
Yeah.
episodes because there's also the corollary of that so many of these topics are still so similar. Like the pivotal angular
Yeah.
points in our lives are still ourself and our relationships and our home and work. And there is this like kind of like connected human experience we have with ancient people through these house topics as well of like yes, things change and some things don't and fascinating. But I
Yeah.
need to be wrapping up pretty soon. And one last thing that I definitely wanted to touch on was how to work with houses if you don't know your birth time.
Mm.
Because as we mentioned, to know exactly what your rising sign is, you need to know the time and location of your birth. And not everyone knows the time of their birth. And so, what you can do with that, what I've been taught by my teacher, Kelly Surtees, is she tends to cast a sunrise chart for your birthday and put that rising sign for whatever time the sun was rising in your birthday and work with it in that way to get some symbolic meaning out of your chart. So you can work with
Hmm.
that if you'd like. There's also a lot of different ways to reconcile a birth chart and try to figure out what your birth chart is if you don't have a birth time. And so there's lots of astrologers out there who can help you with that. And also, if you don't know your rising sign, if you don't have house topics, there's still so much meaning you can get just from planetary placements and from other information that you have with your birthday. So, like, it's okay if you don't have your birth time, but just to cover a couple different ways to work with house topics when you have a birth time, and if possible, getting a birth certificate, getting the most accurate documentation you're able to get for your birth time can really help because sometimes people can live their lives thinking they're one rising sign because their mom told them they were born at 5:30, but actually they were right on the edge and they're a different rising sign, and that can change a lot. So being really accurate with your birth time can also really help make sure that this technique is as effective as possible for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Great. Well, I think we'll wrap up here then. We'll be doing several other episodes about houses, so keep tuning in. And thank you so much, everyone, for listening. Thank you so much for joining us today. If you have any personal stories to share or thoughts and reflections about what we discussed in this episode, please comment down below or reach out to us on Instagram. And please come follow us on Instagram at ConversationsWPlanets, where we share forecasts and updates about the astrological movements happening in the sky, as well as updates about our episodes. The link to our Instagram is in the show notes down below.